The boots hit the dirt in perfect rhythm. Left, right, left. No one dared break formation. Not because the enemy was near, but because he was. The soldiers could feel him before they saw him. A pressure in the air. A tightening in the spine. A sudden straightening of backs that had been sagging just moments earlier. Helmets were adjusted. Rifles held tighter. Eyes fixed forward. Fear did that. Not the fear of bullets or artillery. This was different. This fear had a name. Patton. Somewhere behind the column, a voice barked an order, sharp, absolute, intolerant of delay. A voice that carried certainty like a weapon. A voice that didn't ask men to follow. It commanded them to move faster, fight harder, and die if necessary. Many of the men marching that day hated him. They hated the way he humiliated soldiers in front of their peers. They hated his insults, his obsession with discipline, his refusal to accept excuses. They hated how he demanded perfection from men who were already exhausted, already afraid, already stretched beyond human limits. And yet, under his command they advanced faster. They broke enemy lines more decisively. They held positions longer. They ran toward gunfire instead of away from it. Even when they cursed his name under their breath, they fought harder. That contradiction is the heart of this story. Because war is full of leaders who are loved and forgotten. But history remembers the ones who delivered results, even when their methods made men flinch. Patton did not believe in comfort. He believed in pressure. He believed that fear, properly applied, was not a weakness but a tool. That men who were afraid of failing their commander would move with purpose, clarity, and speed. That chaos could be conquered only by overwhelming force of will. To him, hesitation killed more soldiers than bullets. And so he removed hesitation. But fear has a cost. Behind every perfect formation were clenched jaws. Behind every rapid advance were men running on rage, adrenaline, and dread. Behind every victory was a quiet question that followed soldiers long after the guns fell silent. Was this strength? Or survival under threat? This documentary is not about whether Patton was a good man. It is about why ordinary soldiers, farm boys, factory workers, teachers, became something harder, faster, and deadlier under his command, even when they despised him. To understand that, we must step into their world. A world where mercy was rare, mistakes were fatal, and leadership did not come with kindness. Only results. And in that world, Patton was exactly the man war demanded, whether his soldiers wanted him or not. War does not begin with gunfire. It begins with waiting. Waiting in mud that clings to boots like wet cement. Waiting in hedgerows that smell of rot and cordite. Waiting in silence so loud it makes men hear their own breathing, and wonder if it's too loud. This was the world Patton's soldiers lived in. By the time they reached the front, most had already been stripped down to their rawest instincts. Sleep came in fragments. Hunger was constant. Fear arrived without warning and never fully left. Days blurred together under the weight of exhaustion, punctuated by moments of terror so sharp they burned into memory forever. The battlefield was not heroic. It was claustrophobic. Shells screamed overhead like tearing metal. The ground shook not once but endlessly, small tremors stacking on top of each other until even standing still felt unsteady. Men learned to read the air, to sense when death was near by the way birds vanished or the earth suddenly went quiet. And then there was the terrain. Fields turned into graveyards within hours. Roads disappeared under craters. Towns became skeletal outlines of stone and smoke. Every advance demanded movement through spaces designed to kill. Open ground, narrow streets, ridgelines watched by unseen eyes. War compressed men. There was no room for doubt. No space for weakness. No time to process grief. You lost a friend in the morning, stepped over his body at noon, and followed orders by nightfall. This was the furnace. And inside it, leadership mattered more than ever. A weak leader created hesitation. Hesitation created chaos. Chaos got men killed. Soldiers knew this even if they couldn't articulate it. They had seen units freeze under indecision. They had watched commands get delayed, miscommunicated, softened, until momentum died and the enemy seized the advantage. Fear of the enemy was expected. Fear of confusion was worse. What soldiers wanted, desperately, was certainty. Not hope. Not comfort. Certainty. They wanted orders that cut through noise. Decisions made fast even if imperfect. A sense that someone, somewhere, understood the battlefield and was willing to own the consequences. Patton understood this instinctively. He treated war like a living organism, always moving, always changing, always punishing those who paused too long. In his mind, hesitation was not caution. It was decay. So he imposed motion. Marches were longer. Advances were faster. Retreats were unacceptable. Men were pushed until their legs burned and their lungs screamed because stopping, even briefly, invited disaster. The pace itself became a weapon. Exhaustion dulled fear. Constant movement left no room for doubt. Under that pressure, soldiers adapted. They stopped thinking in days and started thinking in moments. The next order. The next position. The next hill. And something else happened, something darker. Fear of the battlefield slowly merged with fear of command. Disobeying orders felt just as dangerous as enemy fire. Falling behind carried consequences more immediate than distant artillery. The chain of command became absolute, not because men admired it but because their survival seemed tied to it. This was not an army motivated by speeches about honor or glory. It was an army shaped by environment. A world where speed meant survival. Where decisiveness mattered more than empathy. Where leadership was not about being liked, but about being obeyed. And into this furnace stepped a man who believed, without hesitation, that pressure forged strength. A man who would push soldiers past what they believed were their limits, and discover just how far fear could carry them. Long before the battlefield shaped him, Patton had already chosen war. Not as a duty. Not as a profession. But as a destiny that he grew up believing that history did not merely record great men, it summoned them. That some individuals were born to stand at the violent turning points of civilization, where empires rose or collapsed based on a single will imposed at the right moment. Patton wanted to be one of those men. He studied war the way monks studied scripture. Ancient battles, cavalry charges, failed campaigns, nothing was too old or too obscure. He memorized movements, formations, and decisions not as facts, but as lessons etched into his identity. To Patton, war was not chaos. It was a test. A brutal examination of character where hesitation, softness, and doubt were exposed, and punished. From early in his military life, he showed an obsessive attention to discipline. Uniforms had to be perfect. Movements precise. Commands immediate. He believed that outward order created inward control and that control, under fire, meant survival. But beneath that discipline was insecurity. Patton feared mediocrity more than death. He stuttered as a child, forcing himself to overcome it through sheer will. He felt constantly measured against legends of the past, commanders whose names echoed through centuries. He worried not about failing orders but about failing history. This fear drove him. He trained harder than others, studied longer, demanded more of himself than most could tolerate. And when he rose through the ranks, he carried that same intolerance into command. Patton did not see soldiers as fragile. He saw them as unfinished. In his mind, most men underestimated themselves. They believed they were weaker than they were. Slower. Less capable. Fear had convinced them of limits that did not truly exist. Patton's role, at least as he saw it, was to shatter those illusions. Not gently. Not patiently. Violently. He believed that yelling, humiliation, and relentless pressure stripped away excuses. That anger could override fear. That discipline, enforced harshly enough, became instinct under fire. To outsiders he appeared cruel. To critics reckless. To subordinates terrifying. But to Patton this was preparation. He did not want soldiers who thought. He wanted soldiers who moved. Who advanced when ordered, regardless of exhaustion. Who held positions without hesitation. Who trusted that aggression itself created advantage. His philosophy was simple and absolute. Wars are won by men who refuse to stop. And if stopping required kindness to prevent it, he rejected kindness. This worldview followed him into every command he held. Training exercises became brutal tests of endurance. Mistakes were punished publicly. Weakness was not corrected, it was confronted. Some soldiers broke under this pressure. Others hardened. And as global war erupted, Patton found himself facing the moment he had prepared for his entire life. This was not theory anymore. This was not history in books. This was the furnace, and Patton was ready to throw men into it at full speed. When Patton took command, the tone changed immediately. It wasn't subtle. Orders came faster. Marches grew longer. Training intensified until men collapsed from exhaustion, only to be ordered back on their feet. There was no easing in period, no adjustment phase. Patton believed that war did not wait for readiness, so readiness had to be forced. Discipline was no longer a guideline. It was law. Uniforms were inspected down to the smallest detail. Helmets properly worn. Rifles cleaned obsessively. Beds made with precision even in forward areas. To the men it felt absurd, almost insulting, given the chaos surrounding them. But Patton was shaping something deeper. He understood that in combat the mind breaks before the body. When bullets flew and artillery fell, soldiers reverted to habit. If habit was sloppy, panic followed. If habit was precise, action continued. So he made discipline unavoidable. Mistakes were corrected publicly. Excuses were ridiculed. Delays were punished. Fear became immediate and personal. A soldier might survive enemy fire, but not a chewing out from command that echoed across the ranks. Word traveled fast. Everyone knew who had been singled out, who had been humiliated, who had been made an example. And examples mattered. Patton believed that one public correction saved dozens of lives later. That embarrassment today prevented hesitation tomorrow. That fear, focused and controlled, was more reliable than motivation. Speed was the second pillar. He despised static warfare. Trenches invited complacency. Defensive thinking bred fear. Momentum, on the other hand, overwhelmed the enemy and left no time for doubt. Under Patton, units advanced relentlessly. They moved before they felt ready. They attacked before the enemy expected it. They pushed forward while other commanders paused to regroup. Soldiers learned quickly, stopping was more dangerous than moving. This pace was brutal. Men marched until their feet bled. Slept in bursts measured in minutes. Ate on the move. Orders came at all hours, often with little explanation. Questions were not encouraged. But something strange happened. As exhaustion set in, thinking faded. And with it, fear. There was no time to imagine worst-case scenarios. No energy left to question outcomes. Men focused on execution. One step, one command, one objective at a time. Hatred toward Patton grew quietly. They cursed him in foxholes. Mocked him when officers weren't around. Resented his arrogance, his language, his refusal to acknowledge suffering. But in battle, they moved. They held formations under fire. They advanced when other units stalled. They pressed forward even when instinct screamed to stop. Not because they admired him, but because they had been conditioned not to hesitate. Fear of command had fused with fear of combat into a single driving force: forward motion. Patton had created an environment where obedience felt safer than doubt. And in war, that distinction meant everything. Yet this system came at a cost. Resentment hardened. Emotional distance grew. Soldiers stopped expecting understanding from leadership. Compassion was replaced with compliance. It worked, but it was fragile. Because fear can drive men forward, until the moment it breaks them. And that breaking point was closer than anyone realized. No one marched under Patton believing he cared for them. That was never the illusion. He did not ask about families. He did not soften his language when men were wounded or shaken. He did not temper orders to spare morale. To him, morale was not comfort. It was confidence in action. And confidence came from winning. Patton did not seek loyalty through affection. He demanded compliance through results. This created a deep fracture in the ranks. Some soldiers viewed him as necessary. A brutal tool for a brutal war. Others saw him as detached, arrogant, even cruel. An officer who treated men like expendable assets in a larger strategy. What united them was resentment. Men spoke quietly about him when officers weren't listening. They counted the days until reassignment. They wished for commanders who spoke gently, who acknowledged fear, who treated exhaustion as human rather than shameful. But when the fighting started, those same men fought with ferocity. Under Patton, hesitation felt more dangerous than enemy fire. Orders were clear. Objectives unambiguous. There was no confusion about what was expected, or what would happen if expectations were ignored. That clarity mattered. In combat, confusion kills faster than bullets. Men freeze. Orders conflict. Units stall. Fear spreads through uncertainty. Patton eliminated uncertainty. You moved forward. You attacked. You held ground. If you failed, the consequences were immediate and personal. Soldiers hated that pressure. But they trusted the system because it worked. Victories reinforced obedience. Each successful advance validated the harsh methods. Each breakthrough silenced doubt, at least temporarily. Men told themselves that suffering had purpose, that exhaustion was the price of survival. And slowly, something uncomfortable took root. They stopped questioning outcomes, and started measuring everything by effectiveness. Was it cruel? Yes. Did it work? Also yes. That duality haunted the ranks. Patton's leadership stripped war of sentimentality. There were no illusions about fairness or mercy. Only forward motion and consequences. For many soldiers, that was easier to endure than chaos. You could hate a man who pushed you, but you could not argue with momentum. And yet, the emotional toll accumulated quietly. Fear suppressed emotion. Anger replaced reflection. Compassion became weakness. Soldiers learned to shut down anything that slowed reaction time. This produced warriors who functioned flawlessly in battle and struggled deeply afterward. Patton rarely saw this cost, or if he did, he accepted it. To him, war was not about minimizing pain. It was about ending it decisively. And decisive victory demanded sacrifice. The question that lingered among the ranks was not whether Patton was effective. It was whether effectiveness justified everything. That question would soon erupt into controversy. When Patton crossed a line even his supporters could not ignore. Imagine standing there. Your uniform stiff with dried sweat and dirt. Your hands trembling, not from fear of the enemy but from exhaustion so deep it feels permanent. You haven't slept properly in days. Your body hurts in places you didn't know could hurt. And then the order comes. No explanation. No reassurance. Just direction. Forward. Now imagine knowing that refusing, or even hesitating, will bring consequences faster than any enemy bullet. That failure will not be understood. That weakness will not be forgiven. This is the moment Patton's soldiers faced again and again. And this is the moment where the audience must decide. Would you follow him? Not admire him. Not like him. Follow him. Because following Patton was not about belief, it was about pressure. About choosing between two fears. The fear of what lay ahead and the fear of what stood behind you. Many soldiers later admitted something uncomfortable. They did not fight bravely because they felt brave. They fought because there was no alternative that felt safer. Fear narrowed choices. Under Patton, the battlefield became simple. Move or be crushed, by the enemy or by the weight of command. Complexity vanished. Moral hesitation disappeared. The mind, stripped of options, defaulted to action. This was leadership by compression. Patton reduced the emotional bandwidth available to soldiers until only execution remained. There was no space to question strategy. No room to imagine retreat. No time to process loss. And strangely, many soldiers preferred this. Not consciously but instinctively. Because fear, when focused, can be calming. It replaces uncertainty with clarity. It answers questions before they're asked. It removes the burden of choice. You did not need to wonder what to do next. You already knew. The question is whether this was strength or surrender. Did Patton create warriors who overcame fear? Or men who functioned because fear left them no alternative? History often celebrates decisiveness without asking what it costs the human mind. It praises leaders who produce results and ignores the quiet damage left behind. This chapter is not about judging Patton. It is about confronting ourselves. Because every crisis, every war, every collapse, every moment of chaos, forces the same question. When everything is on the line, do we want leaders who understand us, or leaders who push us past understanding entirely? Patton answered that question with absolute certainty. And millions of soldiers lived with the consequences. They rarely spoke about him in official reports. Paper did not capture what it felt like to serve under Patton. Statistics could not translate fear. After-action summaries could not explain hatred mixed with gratitude. The truth lived in foxholes, in half-whispered conversations after midnight, in letters never sent home. Some soldiers remembered the first time they saw him in person. The polished helmet. The rigid posture. The confidence that bordered on theatrical. He looked like a man who belonged on a battlefield even before he spoke. And when he did speak, it was not encouragement. It was command. His words were sharp, uncompromising, sometimes humiliating. He spoke as if weakness were a personal insult. As if fear were a choice that deserved punishment. For many soldiers, that first encounter hardened something inside them. They learned quickly that emotions had no currency here. Fatigue was not an excuse. Fear was not a condition, it was a failure of will. Sympathy was irrelevant. Some men hated him immediately. They remembered moments when they were pushed beyond what felt humane. Forced marches that collapsed men by the roadside. Training drills that continued long after bodies gave out. Public rebukes that burned deeper than physical pain. But those same men remembered something else. They remembered battles where their unit did not freeze. They remembered moments when orders were clear while everything else dissolved into chaos. They remembered moving forward when other formations stalled. Fear of Patton followed them into combat, but so did discipline. One soldier later admitted that under fire, he did not think about survival. He thought about not failing, not slowing down, not being the man who broke formation. That fear kept him moving when instinct screamed to drop. Another soldier described Patton as unbearable, but predictable. You always knew what he expected. You always knew the consequences. In a war where uncertainty killed, Predictability became a form of safety. Not comfort, safety. There were men who cracked under this pressure. Men who froze, faltered, or collapsed. They did not disappear quietly. They were noticed, marked, sometimes punished in ways that left scars far beyond the battlefield. Others adapted. They shut down emotionally, narrowed their world to commands and execution. They stopped thinking in terms of days or outcomes and focused entirely on the next objective. Forward, hold, advance. Hatred became background noise. Survival became the priority. And over time, something deeply unsettling emerged. Some soldiers began to respect Patton, not for his kindness but for his consistency. He never pretended to care emotionally. He never softened expectations. He never lied about the cost of war. He was brutal, but honest. That honesty mattered. Because false hope felt more dangerous than cruelty. When Patton said something would be hard, it was hard. When he said men would die, men died. When he promised victory through relentless pressure, that promise was often fulfilled. Respect did not erase resentment. It coexisted with it. Men could despise the man giving orders and still trust the orders themselves. They could curse his name and still follow him into fire. This is the uncomfortable truth that history struggles with. Leadership does not require affection. It does not even require admiration. Sometimes it requires only one thing. That when everything collapses, someone remains certain. Patton was certain. And in a war defined by fear, that certainty shaped men into something harder than they believed they could be. Even if it cost them something they would never fully recover. The tent was quiet in a way that made everything louder. Canvas walls sagged slightly in the heat. The smell of antiseptic mixed with sweat and fear. Inside, wounded men lay on cots, some groaning softly, others staring at nothing at all. Shell shock had no visible wounds, but it hollowed men out just the same. Patton entered without ceremony. He moved through the tent the way he moved through everything, with purpose, authority, impatience. His eyes scanned the rows of soldiers, taking in bandages, casts, bloodstains. To him, this was a place for the injured, the broken. Then he stopped. On a cot near the center lay a soldier without obvious wounds. No blood, no bandages. Just a man trembling, his eyes unfocused, his body rigid with fear. The soldier said he couldn't take it anymore. That was all it took. Patton's expression hardened. His voice sharpened. Words came fast and cutting, accusations of cowardice, of weakness, of shame. The soldier tried to speak, but fear tangled his words. Patton did not listen. He struck the man. Not once, but hard enough to echo through the tent. The room froze. This was not a battlefield moment. There was no enemy fire. No immediate threat. This was command meeting vulnerability, and responding with violence. Patton stormed out, furious that fear had dared to present itself without physical injury. To him, mental collapse was not a wound. It was a failure of discipline. The soldiers in that tent would never forget it. Word spread quickly. Some defended Patton, arguing that fear was contagious, that visible weakness endangered everyone. That war demanded hardness, not empathy. Others were disturbed. Because this moment crossed a line Patton had been approaching for years. Pressure had become punishment. Discipline had become humiliation. Leadership had become force against the helpless. The military command could not ignore it. Investigations followed. Reprimands were issued. Patton was ordered to apologize, an act that felt foreign to a man who saw authority as absolute. He complied, but reluctantly. The damage was done. Publicly, his image fractured. Privately, his philosophy was questioned. Even supporters wondered whether his methods had finally gone too far. For the soldiers, the incident confirmed something they already sensed. Patton did not see fear the way they did. He saw it as an enemy to be crushed, not a human response to overwhelming trauma. Where others saw collapse, he saw disobedience. Where others saw suffering, he saw a threat to momentum. This moment did not erase his victories. It did not undo his effectiveness. But it forced a reckoning. Because if leadership relied entirely on fear, what happened when fear no longer worked? The slap was not just an incident. It was a warning. That the same force driving men forward could also destroy them. And that even in war there were limits, whether Patton believed in them or not. War forgives many things. It forgives brutality when it produces victory. It forgives arrogance when it delivers momentum. It forgives cruelty when the alternative is collapse. But it does not forgive everything. The slap forced the military to confront a truth it had long avoided. Effectiveness without restraint carried its own danger. Patton's results had protected him for years. His victories spoke louder than complaints. His speed silenced critics who feared hesitation more than harshness. Now that protection cracked. The reprimand was formal, controlled, and deliberately quiet, but its meaning was unmistakable. Patton had crossed a boundary the institution could not publicly defend. Discipline was necessary. Abuse was not. For the first time, Patton was told to stop. Not by the enemy. Not by logistics. But by authority above him. The order to apologize struck at something deeper than his reputation. It challenged his worldview. Patton did not believe in apologies as tools of command. To him, authority flowed downward, not sideways or upward through self-correction. And yet he complied. He stood before soldiers and acknowledged wrongdoing. The words were spoken, but they did not come naturally. They lacked the certainty that defined his command style. They sounded restrained, almost foreign. For the men listening, the moment was surreal. The general who never hesitated was hesitating. Some felt vindicated. Others felt uneasy. A few felt something close to pity, not for the man, but for the fracture in the image of invincibility that had driven them forward. This was not redemption. It was containment. Patton remained a commander. He retained authority. But he was no longer unchecked. Eyes watched him more closely. Reports traveled faster. Tolerance narrowed. And Patton felt it. The pressure he once applied outward now pressed inward. His speeches grew more calculated. His outbursts fewer. His fury, once a weapon, was leashed. But the system he had built did not vanish. The discipline remained. The speed continued. The fear still lingered. Soldiers noticed that the man had been restrained, but the machine had not. This created a new tension. Patton could be wrong. If authority could intervene, then fear was no longer absolute. And absolute fear was the foundation of his command. Yet war does not pause for philosophical adjustment. Battles still demanded speed. Decisions still needed certainty. And despite scrutiny, Patton continued to deliver results. The military faced an uncomfortable conclusion. They could not fully endorse him. They could not fully remove him. So they did what institutions often do. They tolerated the flaw, because the outcome still mattered more. This chapter was not about punishment. It was about limits. About the moment when power met accountability, and did not entirely lose. But accountability did not answer the deeper question. It only delayed it. Why did Patton's men still fight harder, even after seeing the cost? That answer lay not in discipline or fear alone, but in the way the human mind responds to certainty under extreme stress. And that revelation was coming. Fear is usually portrayed as the enemy of courage. But on the battlefield, fear is unavoidable. It cannot be eliminated, only redirected. Patton understood this instinctively. Most commanders tried to reduce fear by offering reassurance, by softening language, by promising safety they could not truly guarantee. Patton did the opposite. He amplified fear, then gave it a direction. Forward. This is the psychological key to why his soldiers fought harder, even when they hated him. Fear without structure paralyzes. Fear with structure mobilizes. Under Patton, fear was never abstract. It was immediate, specific, and predictable. You knew what failure looked like. You knew what was expected. You knew what happened if you hesitated. That certainty mattered more than comfort. In extreme stress, the human brain craves simplicity. Complexity increases anxiety. Too many choices overwhelm the nervous system. But when choices are removed, when only one acceptable path remains, the mind stops debating and starts executing. Patton removed choice. There was no safe retreat. No room for hesitation. No ambiguity about standards. The enemy was terrifying, but so was stopping. Between two fears, soldiers chose the one they could control. They could not control artillery. They could not control ambushes. But they could control obedience. And obedience felt like agency. This is the paradox at the heart of Patton's command. By enforcing discipline so harshly, he reduced psychological chaos. Soldiers no longer had to carry the burden of moral calculation or strategic doubt. That weight was lifted, and placed squarely on command. All that remained was action. This produced a strange kind of calm. Veterans later described moments in battle where fear seemed distant, not absent, but muted. Their bodies moved automatically. Training took over. Orders flowed through muscle memory. Hatred for Patton existed, but it did not interfere. Because emotion requires space. And Patton left no space. His relentless pace kept minds occupied. His standards eliminated debate. His certainty drowned uncertainty. Soldiers functioned not because they were fearless, but because fear had been transformed into momentum. That momentum saved lives in the short term. Units advanced faster. Battles ended sooner. Enemies were overwhelmed before they could reorganize. But this efficiency carried a hidden cost. Fear that is never processed does not disappear. It waits. It settles into the body. It embeds itself in memory. It resurfaces later, when silence returns. Patton's leadership was devastatingly effective in war. It produced soldiers who could endure extraordinary pressure and still perform. It proved that men could be pushed far beyond perceived limits. But it also demonstrated something unsettling. That human beings can be driven to extraordinary feats not by inspiration, but by controlled fear and absolute clarity. This is not a comfortable truth, because it forces us to confront an idea we would rather avoid. That in moments of extreme crisis, kindness may not be what carries people through. Clarity does. And Patton, more than almost any commander of his era, understood how to weaponize it. History is generous with results. It measures victories in territory gained, enemies defeated, wars shortened. It celebrates momentum, decisiveness, and command presence. It rewards leaders who move history forward, quickly. What it rarely measures is what lingers. Patton's leadership worked. That fact is difficult to deny. His units moved faster, struck harder, and broke through where others stalled. His name became synonymous with aggression and speed. But effectiveness is not the same as wholeness. The cost of fear-based leadership does not appear on maps or casualty reports. It surfaces later, in the quiet moments when adrenaline fades and reflection begins. Many soldiers carried Patton with them long after the war ended. Not the man but the pressure. They had learned to silence doubt, suppress fear, and obey without question. Those traits saved them in combat. But in peace they struggled. The world no longer demanded constant motion. The clarity that came from absolute command vanished. And in its place, something unsettling appeared. Emptiness. Some veterans found themselves restless, unable to slow down. Others felt disconnected from emotions they had learned to shut off. Fear, once redirected, returned without structure, manifesting as anxiety, anger, or numbness. Patton never saw most of this. He judged leadership by outcomes achieved in war, not by the psychological aftermath of survival. To him, war was an exceptional state, one where normal rules did not apply. And perhaps he was right. But the question remains. If leadership only works in crisis, what happens when the crisis ends? This question extends beyond Patton. It reaches into boardrooms, governments, and movements that justify harshness in the name of urgency. Leaders who demand sacrifice without offering restoration. Systems that extract performance without acknowledging cost. Fear can mobilize people quickly. It can strip away hesitation. It can produce astonishing results. But it cannot build trust. It cannot sustain meaning. And it cannot heal what it breaks. Patton's brilliance lay in his understanding of human behavior under fire. He knew how to compress fear into action. How to turn chaos into motion. His failure, if it can be called that, was assuming that this was enough. That winning justified everything. History does not offer simple verdicts. Patton was neither hero nor villain in full. He was a man who embodied war's logic, and war is not kind. The question is not whether Patton was right. The question is whether we are honest about what his leadership demanded, and what it consumed. Because the cost we don't measure does not disappear. It waits. Victory has a way of silencing questions. When the guns stop firing and the enemy retreats, results take center stage. Maps are redrawn. Timelines are written. Names are remembered not for how they made people feel, but for what they achieved. Patton's name endures because his method worked. He forced movement when stagnation meant death. He demanded clarity when confusion could destroy entire units. He applied pressure until fear stopped scattering men and began driving them forward. Under him, soldiers became faster, harder, more decisive than they believed possible. And yet, legacy is never built on results alone. It is built on what those results cost. Patton's soldiers won battles, but many carried something heavy with them. They learned that fear could be useful, that obedience could feel safer than choice, that survival sometimes required shutting parts of themselves down. Those lessons saved lives in war. They complicated lives afterward. Patton did not ask to be loved. He did not seek emotional connection. He did not believe leadership was about comfort. In his mind, war was an unnatural state demanding unnatural methods, and sentimentality had no place in it. Perhaps that is why his story still unsettles us. Because it forces an uncomfortable recognition. That in moments of extreme danger, we often trade humanity for effectiveness. That we sometimes accept fear as a tool because it delivers clarity faster than compassion ever could. Patton was not an anomaly. He was a mirror. A reflection of what people are willing to accept when survival is on the line. A reminder that leadership in crisis is judged differently than leadership in peace. His soldiers fought harder under him, not because they admired him, not because they trusted him emotionally, but because his certainty left them no room to hesitate. And hesitation in war kills. The truth is not that Patton was right or wrong. The truth is that his leadership reveals something fundamental about us. That under enough pressure, human beings will endure almost anything, if someone convinces them there is no other choice. Victory answers the demands of history, but it does not answer the needs of the human spirit. And that is the price Patton's story leaves us to reckon with, not just as historians, but as people who may one day be asked to choose between kindness and clarity, between understanding and results, between what works and what it costs. The war ended. The victories were recorded. But the question Patton leaves behind remains unresolved. How much fear are we willing to accept, in the name of winning?